The bulldozers came at dawn, their diesel engines drowning out Sarah's screams as they ripped through her grandfather's creek, the same creek that had flowed for over a century through her backyard. The HOA president smiled from his BMW clipboard in hand, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. But as the last of the crystal-clear water disappeared into the storm drains, neither of them could see what was building beneath their feet. 3 days later, when the emergency sirens wailed and the first basement windows exploded from the pressure, Sarah would realize that some things nature never forgives, and karma has a way of finding the exact right flood zone. The morning. Light caught the creek's surface like scattered diamonds, each ripple carrying the memory of countless seasons. Sarah Brennan knelt beside the weathered stone bridge her grandfather had built in 1952, her fingers trailing through water so clear she could count every pebble on the bottom. The creek sang its ancient song, a gentle murmur that had lulled her to sleep as a child and welcomed her home as an adult. 28 years, she whispered to herself, watching a blue heron take flight from the opposite bank. 28 years I've woken up to this sound. The Willowbrook Creek meandered through the heart of the Riverside Estates development, a thread of wild nature that the original developers had been smart enough to preserve. It flowed from the hills above through Sarah's property, then curved gracefully through the backyards of 6 other homes before disappearing into the stormwater system near the highway. For decades, it had been the neighborhood's crown jewel, the selling point that made their modest ranch homes worth twice what identical houses in other developments commanded. Sarah's phone buzzed against her hip. The caller ID made her stomach clench. Richard Pemberton, HOA president. Sarah, I hope you're enjoying your last morning of that little water feature. His voice carried the smooth arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. The contractors will be here at 8 sharp. Richard, please. We can still stop this. I've got the environmental impact study right here. The decision has been made. The words came out clipped and final. The Homeowners Association voted, and the creek poses an unacceptable liability risk. Children could drown, the banks are eroding, property values are at stake. Sarah's free hand clenched into a fist. 3 houses voted in favor, Richard. 3 out of 7. That's not a mandate. That's a power grab. The Hendersons and the Wilsons didn't vote because they were out of town. Non-votes are abstentions which count as approval according to our bylaws. You know this. The bureaucratic doublespeak made her teeth grind. Those bylaws were written by your law firm, Richard. How convenient that you get to interpret them. 8 o'clock, Sarah. I suggest you move anything valuable away from the work area. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, then hurled it into the soft grass beside the creek. The heron had returned, standing motionless in the shallows, its yellow eyes fixed on some unseen prey beneath the surface. Even the wildlife knew something was wrong. The sound of approaching engines made her stomach lurch. 7:47 a.m. Richard always arrived early to savor his victories. A convoy of vehicles rumbled down Maple Street. 2 bulldozers on flatbed trailers, an excavator, a dump truck, and Richard's pristine silver BMW leading the parade like a hearse at a funeral. Behind them came a white pickup truck with Pemberton Construction emblazoned on the side in bold red letters. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, emerged from her house in a bathrobe, her usually perfect silver hair disheveled with sleep. At 73, Eleanor Chen had lived in Riverside Estates longer than anyone except Sarah. Her property bordered the creek's southern bank, where she'd cultivated a water garden that had been featured in 3 gardening magazines. This is really happening? Eleanor's voice shook as she joined Sarah by the bridge. I'm afraid so. The BMW's door slammed with German precision. Richard Pemberton stepped out wearing a hard hat that had clearly never seen construction dust, his khakis, and polo shirt pressed to boardroom standards. At 52, he'd moved to Riverside Estates only 3 years ago, buying the largest house on the hill with cash from his construction company's profits. Within 6 months, he'd been elected HOA president by promising to modernize the neighborhood and maximize property values. He strode toward them with a clipboard and a smile that belonged in a shark tank. "Ladies, I know this is emotional, but trust me. In 6 months, you'll thank me for having the vision to solve this problem before someone got hurt." Sarah stepped into his path. "The only problem here is you, Richard. This creek has run for over a century without a single accident." Until now, Richard's smile widened as he pulled a photograph from his clipboard. "Yesterday afternoon, little Tommy Morrison, age 6, slipped on those wet rocks you're so fond of. Scraped his knee pretty badly. His parents are considering legal action." Sarah snatched the photo. It showed a small boy with a Band-Aid on his knee sitting beside the creek and grinning at the camera. "This is Tommy playing by the water, Richard. This is a happy kid with a minor scrape. You're using this as justification for environmental destruction? I'm using this as documentation of a hazardous condition. The insurance company agrees." Eleanor Chen's voice cut through the morning air like broken glass. "Your insurance company, Richard. The same company that insures your construction business. How much are you paying yourself to fill in this creek?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Chen, I'll pretend I didn't hear that slanderous accusation. The bid process was completely transparent." "Transparent?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You put the notice on the HOA website for exactly 24 hours, buried it in a 40-page document, and scheduled the vote for the day after Thanksgiving when half the neighborhood was out of town. I followed proper procedures. You manipulated the system and you know it." The lead bulldozer operator, a weathered man in his 60s, climbed down from his machine and approached the group. His name tag read, Frank. "Mr. Pemberton, we're ready to begin. You want us to start at the upstream end and work our way down?" Richard consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. "That's correct, Frank. Fill in the channel completely, grade it smooth, and seed it with grass. By next spring, no one will remember there was ever water here." Sarah stepped between Frank and his bulldozer. "Frank, right? You look like a man who's worked with water before. Does this seem right to you? Filling in a healthy creek because one child got a scraped knee." Frank's eyes shifted between Sarah and his boss. "Ma'am, I just operate the equipment. But I will say this, that's some of the cleanest water I've seen in 20 years of construction work." "Frank." Richard's voice carried a warning. "We have a schedule to keep." "Yes, sir." Frank turned back to Sarah. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I need you to step away from the work area." The first bulldozer fired to life with a diesel roar that sent every bird within a quarter mile into panicked flight. Sarah felt the vibration in her bones, in her teeth, in her heart. Eleanor grabbed her arm. "Sarah, come away. We can fight this in court." "With what money? Against his law firm?" Sarah shook her head. "No, this is it. This is our moment." The bulldozer's blade bit into the creek bank upstream from Sarah's bridge, tearing through ferns and wildflowers that had grown there since before she was born. Muddy water began to flow as the channel was disrupted, the crystal clarity disappearing. In moments. Richard pulled out his phone and began recording. 8:07 a.m., November 15th. Beginning remediation of unauthorized water feature on Riverside Estates common property. Note: property owner Sarah Brennan is present and has been advised to maintain safe distance from work area. Unauthorized? Sarah spun to face him. My grandfather built that bridge with permission from the original developers. We have the paperwork. You have permission for a bridge, not for maintaining an attractive nuisance that threatens public safety. The bulldozer pushed deeper into the creek bed, and Sarah watched 70 years of careful ecological balance disappear under. Tons of steel and diesel exhaust. The water was turning brown now, carrying away the silt and sediment that had been stable for decades. Frank paused his work as the second bulldozer joined the destruction from downstream. The two machines worked toward each other like mechanical jaws, consuming everything between them. Where's all this water going to go? Eleanor asked, her voice small and lost. Richard didn't look up from his clipboard. The storm drain system will handle it. That's what it's designed for. This creek carries snowmelt from the hills, Richard. It's designed to flow gradually into the reservoir system, if you force it all into storm drains at once. I'm not interested in amateur hydrology, Sarah. The city engineers signed off on this project. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. You had city engineers review this? Of course. Everything's been done according to code. But his eyes flickered when he said it, just for a moment. Sarah had been a paralegal long enough to recognize the tell, the microscopic hesitation that meant someone was stretching the truth past its breaking point. The destruction continued with mechanical efficiency. By 9:15, the creek was gone. In its place lay a raw scar of torn earth, rocks, and dying fish gasping in puddles of muddy water. The ancient bridge stood, dawn darkness, slipping past the police barriers with the familiarity of someone who'd spent 28 years walking these streets. What she found stopped her cold. The neighborhood looked like a war zone designed by a demented architect. Richard Pemberton's house, the crown jewel of the development, the symbol of his dominance over the community, had partially collapsed during the night. The entire eastern wing had settled 6 feet into the earth, creating a surreal landscape, where second-story windows sat at ground level and the front door opened onto nothing but air. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the water. Where Willowbrook Creek had once meandered peacefully through backyards, a raging torrent now carved a channel twice as wide and 3 times as deep as the original. The water ran clear and fast, carrying with it chunks of concrete, pieces of Richard's marble countertops, and what looked like an entire bathroom sink. Her grandfather's bridge, built to span a gentle stream, now looked like a toy stretched across a miniature Colorado River. Sarah's phone buzzed. Dr. Walsh. You shouldn't be here. The hydrogeologist's voice was sharp with professional concern. The ground's still unstable. Where are you? National Guard staging area 2 miles. East. We've got satellite feeds of the whole area. Sarah, this situation is unprecedented. I need you to get out of there now. But Sarah couldn't move. She was transfixed by the sound, the roar of water that had been silent for less than a week, but was now announcing its return with the fury of something that had been caged and broken free. Dr. Walsh, the water level, it's higher than the creek ever was. Where is all this water coming from? A pause. That's complicated. Can we discuss this at the staging area? Tell me now. Another pause, longer this time. The creek wasn't just carrying surface water. It was also acting as a pressure relief valve for an underground aquifer. When your HOA president filled in the channel, that pressure had to find another outlet. Sarah felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Another outlet? Think of it like a champagne bottle. The creek was the controlled pour. When you cork that up, the pressure builds until it blows the cork out entirely. And we're standing on the cork. Exactly. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heavy machinery rumbled up Maple Street. Not construction equipment this time, but military vehicles. 2 massive trucks carrying what looked like industrial pumping equipment, followed by a convoy of emergency response vehicles. And bringing up the rear, incongruously, a familiar silver BMW. Richard Pemberton stepped out of his car looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 3 days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his designer clothes wrinkled and stained. But his eyes held the dangerous light of someone who'd decided that if he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. Behind him emerged 3 men in expensive suits, lawyers by their predatory expressions, and a 4th man who looked like he could bench press a small car. Private security, Sarah realized. Richard was traveling with muscle now. Dr. Walsh arrived at the same time, her geological survey, truck pulling up with a spray of gravel. She stepped out and immediately began shouting at the military engineers. Absolutely not! You cannot pump that aquifer. The pressure differentials will destabilize the entire hillside. The lead engineer, a colonel with the kind of mustache that had seen actual combat, approached with a clipboard and the weary expression of someone who'd been having this argument for hours. Ma'am, with respect, we have a federal emergency declaration. Property damage is approaching $50 million and rising. We have authority to take whatever measures necessary to stop the flooding. Colonel Mitchell, I presume? Richard stepped forward with his lawyer brigade flanking him like well-dressed bodyguards. Richard Pemberton, president of Riverside Estates HOA. I want to personally thank you for responding so quickly to this natural disaster. Sarah almost choked. Natural disaster? Dr. Walsh's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Mr. Pemberton, you cannot seriously be calling this a natural disaster. You caused this by illegally filling in a waterway. Richard's lead lawyer, a shark-faced man with silver hair and dead eyes, stepped forward. Dr. Walsh, is it? My client was performing routine maintenance on private property under the authority of a legally constituted homeowners association. Any suggestion that he bears responsibility for subsequent weather-related flooding is both legally baseless and professionally irresponsible. Weather-related? Sarah's voice climbed toward hysteria. It hasn't rained in 2 weeks. The current flooding, the lawyer continued as if she hadn't spoken, is clearly the result of unprecedented underground water table shifts caused by the recent earthquake activity in the region. Colonel Mitchell consulted his clipboard. What? Earthquake activity? A moment of silence stretched long enough for Sarah to hear the roar of water eating away at her neighborhood's foundations. The microseismic events, another lawyer chimed in, were too small to be felt by residents but significant enough to alter underground water flow patterns. Dr. Walsh stared at them with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. That's the most creative fiction I've heard since my daughter's last school play. But Colonel Mitchell was already nodding. Ma'am, I'm not here to determine cause. I'm here to stop the damage. The pumping operation begins in 1 hour. You'll cause a landslide that'll take out half the hillside. That's a calculated risk we are prepared to accept. Sarah realized with growing horror that Richard's plan was working. By framing the disaster as a natural event requiring federal intervention, he was not only avoiding responsibility, but positioning himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The insurance companies would have to pay. The federal emergency management funds would cover reconstruction, and he would walk away not just unscathed, but probably richer than when he started, unless the truth came out. Colonel Mitchell, Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the staging area, before you start pumping, you might want to see something. She walked to her grandfather's bridge, now spanning what looked like a miniature Grand Canyon, and pointed down at the raging water. Look at what's flowing past. The colonel joined her, followed by Dr. Walsh, Richard, and the entire circus of lawyers and military personnel. In the clear water below, debris flowed past like evidence in a flood-borne trial, chunks of concrete stamped with Pemberton Construction, pieces of the bulldozer's metal tracks, and most damning of all, the twisted remains of the signs that had marked the creek's banks. Willowbrook Creek, established 1952, protected waterway. Protected waterway, Dr. Walsh read aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Colonel, are you aware that this was classified as a protected waterway under federal environmental law? Richard's face went white, but his lead lawyer stepped smoothly into the breach. Those signs were installed by a previous property owner without proper authority. The waterway classification was never formally recognized by current regulatory standards. Really? Eleanor Chen's voice cut through the legal doublespeak like a sword through silk. The elderly woman emerged from behind one of the military trucks, carrying a weathered leather portfolio. Because I have the original environmental protection filing right here, dated March 15, 1952, and renewed every 10 years since then. including the renewal I filed personally last month. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a document heavy with official seals and signatures. Federal Environmental Protection Agency, Waterway Designation WB 7743, Willowbrook Creek. Protected status confirmed under the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Environmental Protection Act. Richard's second lawyer grabbed the document and scanned it frantically. Sarah watched his face fall as he realized what he was reading. This changes things, he whispered to Richard. But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at the destroyed remains of his house with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse into a sinkhole. Colonel Mitchell took the document from the lawyer and studied it with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that paperwork could be more dangerous than explosives. Dr. Walsh, in your professional opinion, what are the legal ramifications of filling in a federally protected waterway without proper permits? Dr. Walsh's smile was sharp as winter wind. Criminal charges under the Environmental Protection Act. Civil penalties up to $50 million. Personal liability for all damages caused by the illegal action. And federal prosecution under the Endangered Species Act if any protected wildlife was harmed. Endangered species? Sarah asked. Brook trout. The creek was home to the last native population in this watershed. Sarah remembered the small fish she'd held as it died in her palm yesterday morning. In her mind, she could see Richard Pemberton in an orange jumpsuit, and the image filled her with a satisfaction that was probably not entirely Christian. But Richard wasn't finished. Men like him never went down without taking everyone they could with them. Even if all of this were true, he said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone playing his last card, the damage is done. You can prosecute me. You can sue me. You can throw me in prison. But none of that brings back your precious creek. None of that saves your houses. None of that gives you... The emergency vehicles clustered around the Morrison house like antibodies responding to an infection. Sarah pushed through the gathering crowd of neighbors, her heart hammering as she recognized the signs. Water damage, lots of it, and recent. Fire Chief Martinez emerged from the Morrisons' front door, water dripping from his boots onto the welcome mat that read, "Bless this mess." His weathered face carried the grim expression of a man who'd seen this particular disaster too many times. How bad? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the industrial fans being carried inside. Basement's completely flooded. 4 feet of water and rising. We've got the same situation at 3 other houses on this street. Martinez pulled off his helmet and wiped his forehead. Strangest thing, the water's crystal clear. Usually basement floods are muddy from storm runoff, but this looks like it came straight from a mountain spring. Sarah's stomach dropped. Which houses? Morrison's, obviously. The Hendersons next door. That big place on the hill. Richard Pemberton's house? That's the one. And the Johnsons at the end of the block. Martinez gestured toward the emergency vehicles. We're pumping as fast as we can, but it keeps coming. Never seen anything like it. Through the Morrisons' living room window, Sarah could see 6-year-old Tommy, the same boy whose scraped knee had been used to justify destroying the creek. He sat on the couch in his pajamas, clutching a stuffed dinosaur and watching wide-eyed as firefighters hauled waterlogged furniture from his basement. His mother, Jennifer Morrison, stood in the doorway looking shell-shocked. When she saw Sarah, her expression shifted to something between confusion and accusation. Sarah, did you hear about this? It's like someone turned on a fire hydrant in our basement. Tommy's entire playroom is underwater. Before Sarah could respond, Richard Pemberton's BMW screeched around the corner, tires squealing as he pulled into his driveway. Even from 2 houses away, Sarah could see his face through the windshield, the confident smirk replaced by something approaching panic. He was on his phone before his car door slammed shut, pacing in tight circles on his front lawn while emergency crews worked around him. Sarah couldn't hear his words, but his gestures told the story. Wild hand movements, pointing at his house, then at the street, then at the sky as if he were arguing with God himself. Eleanor Chen appeared at Sarah's elbow, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "My water garden is draining," she said quietly. 40 years I've been cultivating those koi, and the water level dropped 3 feet in the last hour. Where's it going? That's the strange part. It's not draining out, it's draining down, like something underneath is pulling it. Fire Chief Martinez's radio crackled to life. "Chief, we've got a problem at the Pemberton residence. You need to see this." They followed him up the hill to Richard's house, a sprawling colonial that dominated the neighborhood's high ground. The front lawn, usually manicured to golf course perfection, was now decorated with emergency vehicles and industrial pumping equipment. A young firefighter met them at the door, water damage already visible on his boots and pants. "Chief, this is beyond anything in our training manual. The water's coming up through the foundation itself. Not from pipes, not from outside flooding. It's like the house is sitting on an underground river." Through the open front door, Sarah could see Richard in heated conversation with a man in an expensive suit, clearly a lawyer summoned for damage control. But even from outside, the sound was unmistakable, water rushing somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. "How much water are we talking about?" Martinez asked. 8,000 gallons so far, and we can't keep up. The basement's at capacity, and it's starting to flood the main floor." Richard spotted Sarah through the doorway and stormed outside, his face flushed with rage and something else, fear. "This is sabotage," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "You did something to my plumbing. This is criminal damage." Sarah stood her ground. "I haven't been near your house." "Richard, maybe you should call your engineer friends and ask them about water table disruption." "Water table?" The lawyer, a thin man with the predatory look of someone who charged by the minute, stepped forward. "Are you suggesting this flooding is related to the creek remediation project?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. You filled in a waterway that's been flowing for over a century. That water had to go somewhere." Richard's face went from red to purple. "The storm drain system was designed to handle it." "Was it?" Eleanor Chen's voice cut through the argument like a scalpel. "Because I just got off the phone with my son at the city planning office. They never received any engineering reports about your project, Richard. No calculations, no environmental impact studies, no drainage assessments, nothing." The silence stretched for 5 long heartbeats. Richard's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but Richard waved him off. "The paperwork was handled through proper channels." "What channels?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "Because I spent the morning calling every city department that deals with water management. Want to know what they told me?" Richard's jaw worked soundlessly. "They told me that filling in a natural waterway requires permits from 3 different agencies: environmental protection, water management, and flood control. You got permits from exactly 0 of those agencies." Fire Chief Martinez stepped forward. "Mr. Pemberton, are you telling me you diverted a creek without proper permits?" "I remediated a safety hazard on private property." "The creek wasn't on private property." Eleanor's voice shook with decades of suppressed anger. "It's been classified as a natural waterway since 1952. I have the original development plans." Richard's lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something sharp and urgent. Richard shook him off, but his voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. "This is all academic. The work is done, the water has been redirected to appropriate channels, and the flooding is a temporary adjustment period while the drainage system equalizes." As if summoned by his words, another fire truck arrived, followed by a hazmat vehicle, and something Sarah had never seen before, a truck marked Emergency Geological Survey. The Geological Survey team leader, a woman in her 40s with mud-stained boots and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent her career cleaning up other people's disasters, approached the group with a tablet computer and a grim expression. "I'm Dr. Susan Walsh, emergency hydrogeologist. We need to evacuate this entire street." The words hit like a physical blow. Richard's lawyer stepped protectively in front of his client. On what authority? Dr. Walsh didn't even look at him. On the authority of basic physics and 40 years of experience with groundwater displacement. Someone filled in a major water source without compensating for flow redistribution. The water didn't disappear. It's carving new channels through the substrata under your foundations. She tapped her tablet, bringing up what looked like a three-dimensional map of the neighborhood. This is ground-penetrating radar from 20 minutes ago. See these dark lines running under the houses? That's water moving through spaces that were solid earth yesterday. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. The image showed a web of dark channels spreading out from where the creek used to flow, branching like the roots of some underground tree. The channels ran directly under every flooded house. How long do we have? Fire Chief Martinez asked. Until what? Until the foundations give way. Dr. Walsh consulted her tablet again. At current flow rates, maybe 6 hours, maybe less if we get any rain. Jennifer Morrison, who had been listening from her front steps with Tommy still clutched in her arms, let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. 6 hours? We just bought this house. We put every penny we had into the down payment. Richard turned on Dr. Walsh with desperate fury. This is speculation. You can't evacuate an entire neighborhood based on computer models. Dr. Walsh finally looked at him, and Sarah had never seen such cold, professional disdain in another human being's eyes. Mr. Pemberton, is it? I've been consulting on groundwater disasters for 2 decades. Sinkholes in Florida, subsidence in Louisiana, foundation collapse in California. They all start the same way. Some idiot with a construction permit thinks they can outsmart hydrology. She gestured toward his house, where the industrial pumps were losing their battle against the rising water. You diverted approximately 15,000 gallons per hour of creek flow into a storm system designed to handle maybe 3,000 gallons per hour during peak rainfall. The excess had to go somewhere. It went down, into the soil layer under your neighborhood's foundations, and now it's carving new channels through earth that's been stable since the last ice age. Richard's face had gone from purple to gray. The insurance won't cover it. Dr. Walsh's smile was sharp as winter. Environmental damage caused by unpermitted construction work, acts of gross negligence, they'll laugh at your claim all the way to bankruptcy court. The first evacuation bus arrived at the bottom of the hill, its yellow bulk looking strangely cheerful against the chaos of emergency vehicles. Sarah watched her neighbors, people she'd known for decades, carrying hastily packed suitcases and bewildered pets toward an uncertain future. But through it all, she found herself listening to something else. A sound she'd lived without for less than 12 hours, but all read. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland buzzed with the kind of energy that preceded a legal execution. Sarah sat in the gallery watching Richard Pemberton's empire crumble in real time, his team of lawyers reduced to desperate whispers and frantic phone calls as Eleanor Chen methodically dismantled their defense with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a general. 3 weeks had passed since the creek's violent return. 3 weeks of federal investigations, environmental assessments, and media coverage that had turned Richard from a small-town HOA president into a national symbol of environmental destruction. The phrase, Pemberton's folly, had entered the lexicon, describing any attempt to solve problems through willful ignorance of natural law. But the real drama wasn't happening in the courtroom. It was happening back in Riverside Estates, where nature was writing its own verdict. Sarah's phone buzzed with updates from Dr. Walsh, who had remained on site to monitor the ongoing geological situation. The messages painted a picture of beautiful, terrible justice. Creek flow stabilizing at natural rate, water crystal clear, fish population already returning. Pemberton House Foundation completely undermined, demolition crews standing by. New channel carved exactly along original 1890s creek bed. It's like the earth remembered. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with corporate environmental crimes, called the session to order. The courtroom fell silent except for the rustle of papers and Richard's increasingly desperate breathing. "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Are you prepared to respond to the charges?" Richard's lead lawyer, the same shark-faced man who'd tried to blame earthquake activity, rose unsteadily. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and mounting legal bills had taken their toll. His usually perfect silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. "Your Honor, my client maintains that he was acting within his authority as president of a legally constituted homeowners association." "Mr. Blackwood." Judge Hawthorne's interruption was soft but deadly. "Are you seriously going to stand in my courtroom and argue that an HOA president has the authority to destroy a federally protected waterway? The protected status was never properly communicated to my client." Eleanor Chen stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, may I approach?" Judge Hawthorne nodded. Eleanor walked forward with the measured pace of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before, carrying yet another leather portfolio that seemed to materialize from thin air. "Your Honor, I present certified mail receipt 7849-2847-9923, dated September 15th of this year. This documents the delivery of official notice regarding the protected status of Willowbrook Creek to Mr. Richard Pemberton, personally signed by Mr. Pemberton himself." She handed the receipt to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Hawthorne. The judge examined it with the careful attention of someone reading a death warrant. "Mr. Blackwood, your client received official notice of the waterway's protected status 2 months before he destroyed it. How do you explain this?" The silence stretched long enough for Sarah to hear her own heartbeat. In the gallery behind her, she could sense the other displaced neighbors, the Morrisons, the Hendersons, the Chens, all the families whose lives had been upended by Richard's arrogance. Their collective held breath felt like a physical weight in the courtroom. Richard himself sat slumped in his chair, staring at his hands. The man who had once commanded HOA meetings with the authority of a small-town dictator now looked like a deflated balloon, all the air gone out of him. "Your Honor," Blackwood's voice had lost its corporate confidence, My client believed the notice was part of an environmental activist harassment campaign. He didn't realize it was an official federal communication." Judge Hawthorne's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Pemberton received an official notice on federal letterhead with federal seals sent via certified mail, and he thought it was harassment. Environmental groups have been known to create convincing forgeries. Mr. Blackwood." The judge's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Are you suggesting that your client is either too stupid to recognize an official federal document or too arrogant to care about federal environmental law?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Either answer would be devastating. But before Blackwood could respond, Richard Pemberton stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak for myself." His lawyers immediately began whispering urgent protests, but Richard waved them off. He walked to the podium with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who'd finally accepted his fate. "Your Honor, I received the notice. I read it. I understood what it meant." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel for silence. "Mr. Pemberton, I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel before I filled in that creek anyway." Richard's voice grew stronger, carrying the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd decided to burn everything down rather than pretend innocence. "I knew it was protected. I knew I didn't have permits. I did it because I thought I could get away with it." Blackwood looked like he was having a heart attack. The other lawyers were frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how fast they could withdraw from the case. "And why?" Judge Hawthorne asked quietly. "Did you think you could get away with destroying a federally protected waterway?" Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Because I've been getting away with things my entire life, Your Honor. Cutting corners on construction projects, bribing building inspectors, manipulating HOA votes, making problems disappear with money, and lawyers and the right political connections." He gestured toward his legal team. "These men have made careers out of helping people like me avoid consequences, and for 30 years it worked perfectly." Sarah found herself leaning forward, transfixed by this unexpected moment of honesty from a man who'd built his life on deception. "But you can't bribe a creek, Your Honor. You can't intimidate groundwater. You can't lawyer your way out of the laws of physics. I thought I was smarter than nature itself. And nature, well, nature just laughed at me." Judge Hawthorne studied him with something that might have been respect. "Mr. Pemberton, are you entering a guilty plea to all charges?" "Yes, Your Honor. Criminal destruction of protected habitat, violation of the Clean Water Act, endangering public safety through unpermitted construction, and whatever other charges you want to throw at me." He turned to look at Sarah and the other neighbors in the gallery. "I destroyed their lives because I was afraid of a liability lawsuit over a 6-year-old's scraped knee. I cost them their homes, their savings, their sense of security, all to save a few $1,000s on insurance premiums." His voice broke. "I'm guilty of everything you want to charge me with and probably a few things you haven't thought of yet." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Hawthorne set down her papers and looked at Richard with the expression of someone seeing a rare and unexpected phenomenon. "Mr. Pemberton, in 30 years on the bench, I've never heard a defendant voluntarily confess to crimes that could send him to federal prison for 20 years. Prison might be a relief, Your Honor. At least in prison I won't have to watch what I've done to these people." Sarah felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been pity. For 3 weeks she'd fantasized about this moment. Richard Pemberton brought low, forced to face the consequences of his actions. But watching the actual collapse of a human being, even one who'd caused so much harm, was harder than she'd expected. Judge Hawthorne consulted her notes. "Mr. Pemberton, this court appreciates your honesty, but I'm required to inform you that your guilty plea carries a minimum sentence of 15 years in federal prison and financial penalties exceeding $300 million. Are you certain you want to proceed without counsel?" "Your Honor." Richard's voice was steady now, carrying the calm of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. 3 weeks ago, I had a net worth of $40 million, a successful business, and the respect of my community. Today, I'm bankrupt, my company is in federal receivership, and my neighbors cross the street to avoid me." He gestured toward the window, where the Portland skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun. "But you know what the strangest part is? For the first time in my adult life, I'm sleeping through the night. Because I'm finally telling the truth." Sarah's phone buzzed with another update from Dr. Walsh. "Creek ecosystem fully restored. Trout population exceeding historical levels. It's like the last 3 weeks never happened." But they had happened, and the consequences would ripple through all their lives for years to come. Judge Hawthorne made her decision with the swift finality of someone who'd spent decades balancing justice and mercy. "Mr. Pemberton, this court accepts your guilty plea. However, given your cooperation and your commitment to full restitution, I'm sentencing you to 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of supervised release after 3 years if you complete community service requirements." She paused, consulting another document. "Additionally, you will pay full restitute." 6 months after Richard Pemberton was led away in handcuffs, Sarah stood on her grandfather's bridge, watching something she'd never expected to see. Richard himself, knee-deep in Willowbrook Creek, carefully placing river stones under Eleanor Chen's watchful supervision. "A little more to the left, Richard. Eleanor called from the bank, consulting a restoration plan with the thoroughness of a general reviewing battle maps. The trout need deeper pools for spawning, and that configuration isn't quite right. Richard, wearing chest-high waders that had seen better days and a work shirt stained with honest mud, adjusted the stones without complaint. The federal prison had changed him in ways that went deeper than the weight loss and the calloused hands. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by something Sarah had never seen in him before: humility. "How's that, Mrs. Chen?" Eleanor consulted. Her plans again, then nodded approvingly. "Perfect. Now let's work on the gravel bed upstream. The fish need different substrate for their nests." Sarah had to admit the man was trying. Every Saturday and Sunday for the past 3 months, Richard had appeared at the creek with his tools and his supervised release ankle monitor, working 12-hour days on the restoration project. He'd learned more about aquatic ecosystems in 6 months than most people absorbed in a lifetime. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Walsh. "Creek health assessment complete. Biodiversity levels now exceed pre-1950s historical records. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What they were doing was something unprecedented, using the destroyer to heal the destroyed. Eleanor had convinced the federal court that Richard's expertise in construction and earth moving made him uniquely qualified to undo the damage he'd caused. Under her supervision, he'd become the most effective environmental restoration worker the Pacific Northwest had ever seen. "Sarah!" Jennifer Morrison's voice carried across the water. She and Tommy were approaching along the new walking trail that had been built with federal restoration funds, a path that followed the creek's meandering course and included educational plaques about water ecology and environmental protection. 6-year-old Tommy Morrison, the boy whose scraped knee had provided Richard's original justification for destroying the creek, ran ahead of his mother, stopping at every pool to peer into the clear water. "Miss Sarah, come look! There are baby fish!" Sarah joined Tommy at the edge of what had become known as the Morrison Pool, one of the deeper sections that Richard had carved by hand under Eleanor's direction. Sure enough, the water teemed with tiny trout fry, their translucent bodies barely an inch long. "They're beautiful, Tommy. Your creek is having babies." "It's not my creek," Tommy said with the serious logic of childhood. "It belongs to the fish and the birds and the water itself." Jennifer Morrison smiled. "We've been reading a lot of environmental books lately. Tommy's become quite the conservationist." From downstream came the sound of Richard's voice, pitched, loud enough for them to hear. "Mrs. Chen, I think we've got a problem with the water flow around this bend. It's carving too deep on the outside curve." Eleanor's response carried the patient tone of a teacher with a promising student. "That's excellent observation, Richard. What do you think we should do about it?" Sarah walked closer to listen to his answer. "We need to create some deflection structures on the outside bank. Maybe some strategically placed boulders to redirect the current toward the center of the channel. And we should probably add some root wads on the inside curve to prevent erosion during high water events." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "And why is that important?" "Because if the channel gets too deep too fast, it becomes unstable. The banks collapse, the water gets muddy, the fish lose their habitat. Everything's connected. The water, the banks, the trees, the wildlife. You can't fix one part without understanding the whole system." Sarah found herself staring at this transformed version of the man who'd once arrogantly dismissed her concerns about amateur hydrology. The Richard Pemberton who now stood in the creek explaining watershed management was almost unrecognizable from the one who'd ordered bulldozers to fill it in. "Richard," she called out. He looked up, water dripping from his work gloves. "Sarah, how's the house coming along?" The federal restoration funds had allowed her to rebuild not just her home, but to improve it. Solar panels, geothermal heating, native plant landscaping that supported the creek's ecosystem. All the neighbors had received similar upgrades. In the strange arithmetic of environmental justice, Richard's crime had ultimately made their community more sustainable and resilient than it had ever been before. Almost finished. The contractors say another 2 weeks for the final inspections. Richard nodded. That's good. You deserve a beautiful home by the creek. The simple sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. This was the same man who'd once threatened her with lawsuits and sabotage accusations. Now he sounded genuinely pleased about her good fortune. Richard, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret confessing? Your lawyers say you could have fought the charges, maybe gotten a lighter sentence. Richard straightened up, creek water streaming from his waders. For a moment, the old arrogance flickered in his eyes, but it was different now, transformed into something like pride. Sarah, I spent 30 years of my life lying, to clients, to regulators, to my neighbors, to myself. I told myself I was just being practical, just working the system, just doing what everyone else did. He gestured at the clear water flowing around his legs. But you can't lie to a creek. Water doesn't care about your excuses or your justifications or your political connections. Water just flows where it needs to flow, and if you try to stop it goes around you or through you or over you. Eleanor Chen approached from upstream, her restoration plans rolled up under her arm. At 73, she moved through the creek environment with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. Richard, I think we're ready to start on the upstream pools. But first, I want you to explain to Sarah what we're accomplishing here. Richard looked uncertainly between the two women. Mrs. Chen, I'm sure Sarah doesn't want to hear me lecture about— I do, actually, Sarah interrupted. I'd like to understand what you've learned. Richard took a breath, then launched into an explanation that revealed how completely his worldview had changed. We're not just restoring the creek, we're creating a model for how human development can coexist with natural systems. Every structure we build, every plant we introduce, every modification we make to the water flow, it all has to serve both human needs and ecological health. He pointed to various features along the creek bed. Those step pools we built will slow the water during heavy rains, preventing erosion downstream. The native willows we planted will stabilize the banks and provide cooling shade for fish. The gravel beds will support spawning, but they're also designed to filter runoff from the neighborhood streets. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed. And you learned all this in 6 months? I learned it because I had to, Richard said quietly, because Mrs. Chen made it clear that understanding the ecosystem was the only way I could ever hope to repair what I'd destroyed. Eleanor Chen smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose difficult student had finally gotten the lesson. Richard has become one of the finest restoration specialists I've ever worked with. The federal EPA has asked him to consult on 3 other projects. Other projects? Environmental crimes, Richard explained. Places where developers or corporations damaged waterways and ecosystems. They want someone who understands both, the technical challenges and the— He paused, searching for the right words. The moral dimensions of the work. Sarah realized what she was looking at. Not just environmental restoration, but human restoration. Richard Pemberton was being transformed by the same forces that were healing the creek. There's something else, Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling with what Sarah had learned to recognize as Eleanor's particular brand of mischief. Richard, tell Sarah about your proposal. Richard's face flushed red above the creek water. Mrs. Chen, I don't think— Tell her, Richard. He sighed. I want to donate my remaining assets to create an endowment fund for creek restoration throughout the Pacific Northwest. Everything I have left after restitution, about $2 million, would go toward protecting and restoring waterways, like this one. Sarah stared at him. You're giving away everything? Everything I have left, yes. I don't need much. I've got a small apartment, reliable transportation, meaningful work. Everything else is just... He gestured vaguely. Stuff I accumulated when I thought wealth was the same thing as worth. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the water. Tommy Morrison had been joined by several other neighborhood kids, all of them peering into the clear pools and exclaiming over the fish and insects they discovered. You know what I realized? Richard continued. I spent 30 years trying to control everything around me. Control my business, control my neighborhood, control nature itself. And all it got me was 5 years in federal prison and the knowledge that I'd destroyed something beautiful. He bent down and scooped up a handful of creek water, so clear that Sarah could see every line in his palm through the liquid. But this creek taught me something I never understood before. You can't control. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the same spot where Richard's bulldozers had first broken ground, but the world around her had been transformed beyond recognition. The creek ran deeper and clearer than historical records suggested it ever had, bordered by native plants that attracted wildlife from across the region. But more than that, the space itself had become something unprecedented. A living laboratory where environmental restoration science met community healing. The Willowbrook Creek Conservation Foundation had grown from Eleanor's ambitious vision into a nationally recognized model for environmental justice. The campus now included research facilities, educational centers, and demonstration gardens that hosted thousands of visitors each year. Scientists from universities across the country came to study the creek's remarkable recovery, while communities dealing with their own environmental disasters sent delegations to learn about the Riverside model. But today wasn't about science, or policy, or national recognition. Today was about coming home. Sarah watched from her grandfather's bridge as a familiar figure emerged from the Foundation's field office, leading a group of graduate students on their morning creek assessment. Richard Pemberton, now 58, with silver threading through his hair and laugh lines that spoke of 5 years spent working outdoors, moved through the restored landscape with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Professor Pemberton. One of the students called out, "Can you explain again why the step pools are positioned at these specific intervals?" Richard knelt beside the water, his practiced hands pointing out the features he'd learned to read like scripture. It's all about energy dissipation and habitat creation. Each pool slows the water just enough to prevent erosion while creating different microenvironments for various species. Sarah smiled, remembering the arrogant man who'd once dismissed environmental concerns as amateur hydrology. The Richard, who now taught graduate-level courses in restoration ecology, had earned his expertise through 5 years of hands-on work, published research, and what Eleanor called the best education possible, learning from your own mistakes. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Eleanor. "Ready for the ceremony? Board meeting in 10 minutes." The monthly board meeting of the Willowbrook Creek Conservation Foundation was held in the same community room where Richard had once manipulated HOA votes through bureaucratic sleight of hand. But the dynamics had shifted dramatically. The displaced neighbors of Riverside Estates now served as the foundation's governing board, overseeing Richard's work with the same attention to detail he'd once used to control them. Sarah entered the meeting room to find her neighbors already assembled. Jennifer Morrison, now a certified watershed specialist, the Hendersons, who'd used their insurance settlement to become full-time environmental educators, Mrs. Wilson, whose background in accounting made her the foundation's treasurer, and Eleanor Chen, now 88 and still sharp as a blade, serving as board chair emeritus. Richard sat at the opposite end of the table from his old position of power, a stack of progress reports in front of him, and the quiet demeanor of someone who'd learned to listen before speaking. "Before we start," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling with familiar mischief, "I have an announcement." She pulled out yet another official-looking document from her seemingly endless supply of important papers. The Environmental Protection Agency has awarded the Willowbrook Creek Conservation Foundation the Presidential Environmental Restoration Award. We'll be receiving the honor at a ceremony in Washington next month." The room erupted in congratulations and applause. Richard sat quietly, his face reflecting a complex mix of pride and humility. "Congratulations, Richard," Sarah said. 5 years ago, who would have imagined you'd be receiving a presidential award for environmental work?" Richard's laugh carried no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him. 5 years ago, I thought environmental protection was a conspiracy to hurt property values. I've learned a few things since then, such as the fact that protecting the environment and creating prosperity aren't opposites. They're the same thing, if you're smart enough to think beyond the next quarterly profit report. He gestured toward the window, where the creek sparkled in the afternoon sun. This restoration project has brought more economic development to our region than any of my construction projects ever did. Scientific research, educational tourism, sustainable technology development, we've created hundreds of jobs that didn't exist before. Jennifer Morrison nodded enthusiastically. Tommy's entire 5th grade class is studying to become environmental scientists because of what they've learned here. That's 25 kids who see their future in protecting the planet instead of exploiting it. "Speaking of Tommy," Eleanor said, "I believe he has something to present to the board." As if summoned by his name, 11-year-old Tommy Morrison burst through the conference room door, followed by his entire 5th grade class. He was taller now, but still carried the same infectious enthusiasm that had once led him to play by the creek where his scraped knee had started this entire chain of events. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Pemberton, we finished our project." The students spread out a hand-drawn map that covered most of the conference table. It showed Willowbrook Creek in intricate detail, from its source in the hills to its confluence with the Yei River, but with annotations and additions that revealed months of careful observation. "We mapped every pool, every rapid, every bend in the creek," Tommy explained with the serious pride of a young scientist. "But we also tracked all the animals that live there, all the plants that grow along the banks, and all the ways people use the watershed." Sarah leaned closer to examine their work. The map was beautiful, not just scientifically accurate, but artistic in its attention to detail. Different colored pencils showed water depth, vegetation types, wildlife corridors, and human impact points. "This is incredible work," Richard said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd discovered a talent for teaching. "What did you learn from creating this?" A girl named Maria, who'd been one of Tommy's creek exploration partners since kindergarten, raised her hand. "We learned that everything is connected. Like the trees upstream affect the water temperature downstream, and the fish population affects the bird population, and where people build houses affects everything. And," Tommy added with 11-year-old intensity, "we learned that when adults make mistakes, they can fix them if they really try." The room fell silent. Richard's face flushed, but he met Tommy's gaze directly. "Tommy, do you remember when you got that scraped knee by the creek back when you were little?" "Kind of. I remember being sad when the water went away. I used your scraped knee as an excuse to fill in the creek because I was afraid someone might sue me if a child got hurt. I was so worried about protecting myself that I destroyed something beautiful that belonged to everyone." Tommy considered this with the seriousness that children bring to adult confessions. "But you fixed it, right? The creek is better now than it was before." "We all fixed it, Tommy. Your neighbors, Dr. Walsh, Mrs. Chen, lots of people working together. But you're right. The creek is better now, and so is our community." Eleanor Chen rose from her chair with the ceremonial gravity of someone about to make history. "Which brings us to today's special business. The board has voted unanimously on a resolution I'd like Richard to hear." She pulled out one final document, this one bound in leather and stamped with official seals from every level of government, from local to federal. "Richard Pemberton, 5 years ago, you appeared before this community as someone who had caused terrible harm through arrogance and greed. Today, you stand before us as someone who has dedicated his life to healing that harm and preventing others from making similar mistakes. Richard's hands were trembling slightly as Eleanor continued. The Willowbrook Creek Conservation Foundation Board of Directors hereby votes to grant you full pardoning of all community sanctions, restoration of your standing as a neighbor in good faith, and our unanimous recommendation that your supervised release be converted to full community partnership status. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what Eleanor was doing. After 5 years of exemplary service, Richard was being offered something more valuable than money or property, redemption and genuine forgiveness from the people he'd wronged. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, we'd like to offer you permanent directorship of the foundation, with full authority to expand our work throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Richard sat in stunned silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Tommy piped up from across the room. Say yes so you can keep fixing creeks everywhere. Richard's laugh was shaky but genuine. Yes, of course, but only if you'll have me as a neighbor, not just an employee. I'd like to build a house here by the creek, a small house that works with the ecosystem instead of against it. Sarah found herself standing up. Richard, there's something I need to tell you. The room turned to her expectantly. My grandfather left me a letter before he died. I was supposed to open it when the creek was threatened. I never did. I was too angry, too focused on fighting you to remember his wisdom. She pulled a yellow,